Hey folks, Brian here with the Coastal Patrol Cub, and today is December 1st, which means I believe I am actually legally obligated to say happy birthday to the Civil Air Patrol, which was founded on this day, December 1st in 1941. Or was it? So I am here to chew bubblegum and ruffle some feathers, and Scotty, I am all out of Beamans. Interesting discussion to be had regarding the birthday of Civil Air Patrol. I will preface this by saying that, first of all, stick through to my conclusion. I think you will hopefully learn something along the way. I think you will appreciate it, and this is all in good fun. So don't think that I'm actually jabbing at Civil Air Patrol National Headquarters or anything like that. I will get into why I believe we celebrate the date that we do, and the reasons for that, and again, so stick with me here. That being said, as with many things, there is a lot of history, right? And there is a lot of history regarding this date and the establishment of Civil Air Patrol and what all went down, and history is messy and can't necessarily be condensed down to such simple things. So again, if you have any involvement in Civil Air Patrol whatsoever, if you've been a cadet or a senior member or just tangentially aware of the program, you probably have heard this before. On 1 December 1941, Civil Air Patrol was established under the leadership of Major General Curry as the first national commander, and boom, Civil Air Patrol came to be on 1 December 1941. Again, the truth is a little more complicated than that. So first of all, in terms of the lead up to when Civil Air Patrol was established, there is so much there, so much more than I can go into in a video like this. I will talk about my primary resource for this video, and I will post a link in the description to that. Goes into so much more detail. That's just kind of outside the scope. I have talked about some of this stuff a little bit before in some of my previous videos, so some of this won't be entirely new if you've seen some of my other stuff. But again, there is way more here than I can possibly go into. So in terms of understanding the roots of where Civil Air Patrol came from, we actually, it's kind of interesting. You can almost actually tie it back to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Why is that? Well, Gil Rob Wilson, who again, if you've been involved in Civil Air Patrol, you may recognize that name. He was one of the founding fathers of Civil Air Patrol. He went to Germany. He actually traveled from New Jersey on the Hindenburg to Germany. Wilson was the head of the New Jersey State Aeronautics Department, and he went over to Germany and he saw what they were doing to prepare their pilot force. Now, for those of you who have studied history, you know, obviously after World War I, Germany was extremely limited in the military that it was allowed to have. Of course, it broke some of those rules, but on paper, it was very limited on what it was allowed to have militarily, all that sort of thing. One of the ways Germany was very forward thinking in that time was it said, hey, we are going to need a lot of pilots if we're going to establish an air force, and how can we grow that pilot force under the auspices of a civilian organization, right? And so one of the things, glider clubs in Germany were very, very popular in that time, and they did all these sorts of things inspiring the youth to start flying, so the glider clubs, flying clubs, that sort of thing. So Wilson traveled over to Germany. He saw all this going on. He came back to the States, and he was interesting. He apparently met with someone while he was there that had been a submarine officer in World War I, again, on the German side, so a U-boat officer in World War I. And that U-boat officer talked about how the East Coast waters of America would be prime hunting ground for U-boats in a conflict, right? So Wilson came back, for one, having seen what Germany was doing, saying, hey, that's pretty smart. If we're heading towards conflict, and I believe he was one of the people who thought we were, again, we ought to really work on building up our own pilot force ahead of time so that when things kick off, we have a pool of pilots that we can quickly get through the military portion of the training and press into service. The other thing that he came away with was the understanding that even as far away as America was in the world physically, the battle could be brought to our shores, and civil defense was going to be important. So again, this was in 1936. So fast forwarding from 1936 through 1941, Wilson was certainly not the only person to have these thoughts. There were several efforts that were being undertaken during this time to stand up America's civilian pilot force and an eye on civil defense and all these things. There were several concurrent efforts that were happening along this time. Eventually, what happened was essentially the United States sat down and said, okay, we need to decide on what approach we're going to take, how are we going to move forward on this, right? And they settled on the idea of the Civil Air Patrol and the organization that was the early Civil Air Patrol. So in May of 1941, the Office of Civil Defense was stood up, with its first head being the New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, of LaGuardia Airport fame, right? LaGuardia, again, was the first head of the Office of Civil Defense, and so he was given the task, essentially, of organizing this Civil Air Patrol under the Office of Civil Defense. Now, what's interesting to note is in November of 1941, LaGuardia said, basically, hey, nobody push anything out about Civil Air Patrol. Nothing proceeds further until I put my signature to it and I approve it, right? But again, all these efforts were being undertaken, all things were getting put into place. It was all kind of coming together throughout 1941, from early 1941 through, late fall. So where does 1 December come from? Well, here's where 1 December comes from. On 1 December, LaGuardia, and I'm going to just read directly from the book here. I forgot to mention earlier, so the source that I mentioned is a book by Frank Blazich, who was he was the national historian for Civil Air Patrol for a time. Very smart guy. He's actually a curator for the Smithsonian American History Museum. And I've talked to him several times. Super duper helpful. He's got this book and several articles. Very, very knowledgeable on Civil Air Patrol history. So I'll put a link. This book is freely available as a PDF from the Airpower University Press. So I'm going to put a link to that in the description so you can dive into all the history that I'm skipping over here, right? But I'm going to read this directly from his book. So on 1 December, LaGuardia approved the creation of a CAP division within the Office of Civil Defense, OCD, and placed his signature on a simplified establishment order intended for inclusion in an informational booklet about CAP. Again, a simplified establishment order that was going into an informational booklet. So the thing about that memo is, again, yes, he signed it on 1 December. It laid out the establishment of Civil Air Patrol, but it was not published at that time. It was not distributed. Nothing went out saying, hey, Civil Air Patrol, boom, you are started, let's go, right? It was again, intended for this booklet. It was being put in. And what's interesting is it talks about, in the footnote here, in Frank's book, there's some extemporaneous communications going on that basically noted that the Office of Civil Defense staff was afraid that a long, detailed order may first confuse the people in the field, and secondly require so much revision as the show develops as to cause further confusion among those who will have seen the initial booklet, but not understand completely the interior administration reasons requiring changes and ways of doing various things. In other words, they were afraid that if they really laid out a detailed establishment order in this booklet that was going out to all the Civil Air Patrol, presumably all the units at least, if not members at the time, saying, hey, this is how the way things are, but they recognize that they're just laying this down, things are going to change, right? And so they're like, if we put out too much detail too soon, and then we have to change a bunch of things, it's just going to cause confusion. So again, it was a very simplified order saying, hey, this is how things are going to be laid out, and it's going to be in this informational booklet. And that's why that was there, right? So that is where the 1 December comes from. Officially, the first time LaGuardia put pen to paper and said, I'm establishing the Civil Air Patrol, was 1 December. However, that was not public. It was not distributed, and nor was it intended to be quite yet. Fast forward a little bit, obviously Pearl Harbor happens, and on the 8th of December, Office of Civil Defense Order number 9 was signed by LaGuardia, and this was the formal establishment of Civil Air Patrol. That evening, LaGuardia announced Civil Air Patrol's existence in a national radio broadcast, and they released a press release defining the new organization. So it was 8 December that, no kidding, he wrote what we would consider in the military, the official order, like, hey, go forth and do, right? The 1 December order signature was like, hey, this is how things are going to be, but it was the 8 December order that was, no kidding, Civil Air Patrol stood up as of right now, Major General Curry, you've got it, go forth and conquer, right? So that being said, why do we celebrate 1 December? Now, there's probably a couple schools of thought on this. It would be easy to say, like, hey, just general confusion. And in fact, again, Frank mentions in his book that Civil Air Patrol National Headquarters General Orders Number 1, issued on 7 January 1942, so just a month after the establishment-ish, document declares that on 1 December 1941, quote, the following statement was issued from the Office of Civilian Defense listing CAP as being established, whereas the same document on the same page reports Administrative Order Number 9 as, quote, establishing the Civil Air Patrol. So this initial memo, this General Order Number 1 from Civil Air Patrol on the same page says 1 December and 8 December, right? And references the two different documents. So obviously there was some confusion. I think obviously people are going to want to go with the earlier date just in general. I think that makes sense. But I think there's something else to this. And that is, I think Civil Air Patrol likes to emphasize the 1 December 1941 date as its birth date, because in doing so, I think their intent is to highlight that Civil Air Patrol was a forward-thinking organization, that we were not reactionary, we were not reacting to the events of Pearl Harbor, which of course happened on 7 December, right? So by saying, hey, we were established on 1 December before we even went to war, right? And it establishes this, we were forward thinking, we knew we were going to need something like this, we were working to stand all this up, and we were established, and Civil Air Patrol was in operation, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and we were already there ready to go. Here's the thing with that. They're not wrong. Right? And so that's why I don't necessarily mind Civil Air Patrol emphasizing 1 December as its birth date, even though I think administratively and kind of the technical correct answer is really 8 December in my mind. I would personally view that as the actual establishment date. I think emphasizing the fact that we were a forward-thinking organization and we were working prior to the United States being attacked at Pearl Harbor is 100% correct. Right? Because it is not like LaGuardia just spoke out into the wind on 1 December and said, let there be a Civil Air Patrol, and boom, everything was there. Again, this was the culmination of months and months and months of effort. Everybody had been working towards this goal. There had been, meetings to figure out how this was all going to be arranged. Major General Curry was already identified as he was going to be the one leading the charge as the first national commander, right? These gears were turning, these wheels were rolling. It was going to happen whether Pearl Harbor happened or not, right? This was already going to be established. So by emphasizing the 1 December date is our way of saying, like, it's our way of acknowledging that this work was taking place prior to the United States entering the war. And again, I think that is 100% accurate, because when you look at it, I mentioned one of my previous videos how our first coastal patrol mission, and that's aside from all the other stuff that Civil Air Patrol did, but our first coastal patrol mission happened in March of 1942, right? Within the span of a few months, we had enough structure and everything to go out and start performing actual coastal patrol missions. There is no way that could have happened that quickly had all that work prior to December of 1941 not happened. So again, I think the emphasis on our birth date being 1 December 1941 is good. I think our reasons are pure, and I think that it gets the point across of we predate the United States' entry into the war. We were working before that to build a civilian pilot force and to perform all these stateside missions, and all those things were in the works, if not yet in place, prior to the entire United States going on a wartime footing. So I think that emphasis is correct. However, again, if you want to get technical about it, 8 December is really when the Office of Civilian Defense said, hey, establish the Civil Air Patrol. That is truly when the order went out, said, go forth and do. So all that is to say, if you celebrate 1 December as the birthday, if you think I'm full of hot air and I'm completely wrong, go forth and do. I will still celebrate. I will make a post every year about 1 December 1941. Happy birthday to the United States Civil Air Patrol. I don't have a problem with it, really. But if you're, maybe a unit historian and you want to talk about something with your cadets or your senior members for that matter, and you want to talk about a little more detail to the history, there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of really cool, again, from 1936 to 1941, there is 5 years of effort there that I completely did not touch in this video because it's well outside the scope of what I wanted to talk about. But it's all really good, really interesting stuff. So by all means, dig into it. And again, the book that I'm going to publish, or not publish, but the book that I will post in the description of this video goes into a lot of those details. And there's a lot of other stuff out there that's super interesting. So please continue to learn. Go look at that stuff. I hope that I can help continue to educate, and I hope you found this interesting. So thanks. Have a good one, and happy birthday, Civil Air Patrol.